Hi guys, Jan Morex here. After a long time, I'm back with a new tutorial. In this tutorial, I'm gonna break down my recent project and discuss all the interesting subjects one by one. I made those images based on a reference photo. I chose that image because of the perfect composition, interesting camera angle, captivating lighting, and overall simplicity of the scene, which made it possible to translate it into a tutorial. As usual, I relied on Blender as my main 3D software and Octane for rendering. There are two primary surfaces in the project, a road and a field. The road looks incredibly realistic and it perfectly fits the project. Creating it was very easy. I just used a photoscan texture from texture.com. Guys, I absolutely love that site. It provides some of the finest photoscan textures and assets in the market, perhaps even the best. The texture I used for the road is called Road Gravel. This texture comes in different resolution versions, including 16K, which makes it ideal for close-up shots. For that project, I used the 8K version. Once you download the textures, you can easily plug them into the appropriate slots to create the road material. Remember, when working with displacement in Octane, make sure to apply the scale of your object. I wanted to have my material slightly brighter and less saturated. I added a color correction node and adjusted the sliders. I followed the same approach for the field too, but this time I visited a site called Polyheaven, which provides free 3D models, textures, HDR maps. From there, I downloaded a photoscan material called Fluorescent 01. The material will be covered with grass and plants. I'm not gonna make it too advanced. To avoid visible texture repetition, I usually implement two techniques. Firstly, I utilize a chaos texture node, which effectively scatters an input texture randomly over a surface, helping to hide any visible seams in image textures. Secondly, I mix two versions of the same albedo map, adjusting the brightness, saturation, or even the scale. Then, I use a noise texture to control the distribution of these two versions. It is good to use contrast colors to better visualize how the noise texture works. To create a more natural transition between the road and the ground, I use displacement modifier, but only in the X direction. Another crucial thing for that project is 3D models of grapes. I didn't model them by myself, but I found great models on the internet. Usually, I use models that we as 3D shakers are selling. Unfortunately, none of our models were suitable for this project. My next choice is CG Trader. I found there this nice model and two more models of grapes I bought from TurboSquid. While the models were good, I was not fully satisfied with the materials of the leaf. To address this, I created a new and more advanced leaf material to make it look more realistic. I usually use the following workflow when I need to have perfect leaves for the close-up shot. I went back to texture.com and downloaded leaves material for grapes. Then I opened the model and adjusted UV islands to fit the new textures. After that, I created a new material for grape leaf with these nice photoscan textures. That process took some time, but now I'm more happier about the leaf material. Once the grape models were ready, I linked them to the main scene as instance. This is my usual approach when adding high poly models like trees, bushes, or cars to a scene. Instead of copying and pasting them to the scene, I link them from their original blend file. There are advantages and disadvantages coming with that approach. In a nutshell, the main advantages for me is that adding linked objects doesn't increase your blend file size, so your scene remains small and responsive. Now we can distribute the grape bushes across the field. I initially tried to use particle systems or geonodes to automate the process, but in the end I decided to do it manually to maintain complete control over it. It was a bit tedious process, but with a good podcast about Tolkien books, everything went much smoother. The next big topic we need to talk about is particle systems. I love creating environments, and the essential part of the process is using particle systems. I know that nowadays there is a new big shiny feature becoming more and more popular and gradually pushing particles aside. Yes, I'm talking about geonodes. That's definitely the future, and I have to learn it, but our team at Zoria Studio has an entire workflow based on particles. My render is based on a real photo, and I try to mimic how the grass, plants, and debris looked in the photo. The first thing you can notice when you look at the photo is that there are regular repeating stripes of different ways how the ground is covered. There are fewer grasses and plants under the grapes, and more of them cover the gaps between the lines of the grapes. To mimic this, we need to create vertex groups that control the distribution of our particles. There are several ways to prepare vertex groups or weight maps. You can select part of the geometry in edit mode and assign it to the vertex group, which will automatically create a weight map. Alternatively, you can switch to weight paint mode, where you can freely paint your weight map. Finally, you can use add-ons such as Weightlifter to create weight maps based on specific requirements. I usually use the camera visibility function, which creates a weight map based on the distance from the camera. I set up 3 weight maps for the scene. One map is dedicated to the plants under the grapes. The second map is for the entire ground. Its distribution is based on the distance from the camera. The last weight map is for the plants growing between the rows of grapes. To cover the ground, I used various grasses, plants, rocks, small branches, and natural elements like that. Although I'm not going into too much details about the process and settings of each particle system, I'll explain the first one in more depth and briefly touch upon of the others. This plant is from Megascans. It's a perfect fit for this scene. I really appreciate the balance between the level of detail and the poly count of Megascan plants. They might not be suitable for close-ups, but for distant or semi-distant shots, they are perfect. At Zoria Studio, we have all our assets neatly organized in the asset browser, and many of our greenery models are set up as particle systems. This means that we can easily drag and drop them into the scene and find them in the particle system list. It's a quick and easy way how to populate our scenes with beautiful greenery. But back to our rabbit grass. Let's quickly look at the settings. I use Hair, Advanced. As a vertex group, I use Under the Grapes. And there's also a procedural black and white texture applied for advanced randomness of distribution. I use those textures all the time. It's the perfect way how to break the uniformity and bring a more natural way of distribution. At first, you choose the type of texture. I almost always go with clouds. Then you play with size. After that, you choose what parameters and how significantly should be influenced by this texture. I prefer density and hair length. Lastly, I played around with the contrast, increase or decrease the effect as needed. I experimented with many other plants from Megascans and spent some time playing with their amount, way of distribution, size, in order to reach a similar ground cover as is in the reference photo. The next thing I added was some low poly rocks. I made them darker and placed them under the grapes. They should create an appearance of plowed land. As you can see, those rocks aren't distributed as single objects but in clumps. The reason is that when you need to have, let's say, 1 million of something distributed on a plane, for example, 1 million rocks, is more efficient to create one object by merging 1000 objects of rocks and then use this object as an object that will be distributed. Why is it better? It significantly reduces the time needed to load the scene into a GPU memory. On the other hand, of course, it's not as precise as using single object, but more about that in a separate tutorial. Another interesting thing I'd like to cover is the transition between the road and the field. I was looking for a way how to make it as smooth and natural as possible without having hard edges. I came across some nice decals on Megascan. These are not 3D objects, but rather textures. I applied the textures onto a plane. With the help of displacement and alpha texture, it now looks like a 3D object. I use these planes as objects for distribution with the particles. With such an approach, you can easily add details to various surfaces in your projects. To add some variety, I also included 2 more types of rocks, small and large. We are slowly getting there, and usually in this phase of a project, I'm about to begin playing with lighting, which is by far my most favorite part of doing rendering. Before we jump into it, let's add a few things to make our scene complete. The main object of the project is a car. I've chosen one of the cars from our 3D Shakers library, the Porsche Panamera GTS. This model is compatible with both Cycles and Octane. You can find this car also in our Ultimate Cars collection on the Blender market. The only car collection with models prepared for both Cycles and Octane. For only $149, you would get 43 luxury, sports and family cars. And as a bonus, future updates which extend collection by new cars. If you use the promo code tutorial, you'll receive a 25% discount on your purchase. We placed the perfect car, but something is still missing. This image should convey a feeling of a hot summer day. A long time passed without any rain. The grass is turning dry, getting a yellowish color. The road is dry and dusty, resulting in cars producing a lot of dust while driving. Initially, I wanted to create a simulation of a perfect dust cloud coming out of the tires. I realized that I have no idea how to simulate such a thing, so I came up with plan B, which is to use pre-made VDB clouds by Travis Davis. I included a link to them in the description. It's quite easy to use them in Blender and Octane. Just follow these simple steps. Shift+A, import OpenVDB, find the directory with the clouds, open one you like, downscale it to fit your needs, click New Material, and play with those settings, primarily with density, until you get something you like. Then I placed one big cloud behind the car and a few smaller ones behind each wheel. I'm aware that such an approach isn't perfect, but I'm quite happy with the result. To add some finishing touches, I downloaded wooden sticks from Megascan, also this nice rock wall, which I stole from my previous project, and one perfect model of the drone. Alright, I think the scene is now complete. Let's do some renderings. Often I do renderings based on photos, which involves trying to mimic the lighting that is on reference photo. It's a great way for me to learn, and it forces me to analyze the lighting and try new ways to light the scene. Later, when I'm more or less satisfied with my interpretation of the reference images, I spend some time trying various lighting to change the atmosphere of the image and move it further. This is my favorite part of the whole process. Pursue the best lighting. For most of my projects, I use HDR maps to light the scene, and just very occasionally the sunlight system that comes with the Octane engine. I use HDR maps from various sources, but since I have an add-on from HDR Heaven, more than any other HDRs, I use their maps. That add-on provides hundreds of high-quality HDRs nicely packed in the asset browser and sorted into categories. It's connected to the server where they store all their files, so always when there's a new HDR map available, you can easily download it through a Blender. However, it's only prepared for Cycles, not for Octane yet. I always try many different HDR maps, rotate them, and look for the best sound angle. Sometimes I use a color correction node in the world setup to play with saturation or hue, but usually I work just with gamma to increase the contrast of the HDR, resulting in more prominent harsh shadows, or decreasing the gamma to reduce the contrast between light and shadows. The next thing that influences the look of the image is color management setting. I may have discussed this in one of my previous tutorials, so I'll keep it brief. In Octane, you can find the color management settings in the Octane Camera Imager panel. You can have different settings for preview rendering and for the final render. But honestly, I've never used it. I always check this override checkbox to ensure that both previews and final renders produce the same result. The settings in the panel are pretty self-explaining. What's interesting is that you can use different OCOs, which very simply put is a thing that influences the overall color look of your images. Personally, I prefer to use a T-Cam OCO that was prepared for Octane in Blender by Edward O'Connell. It provides multiple LUTs to choose from and several contrast levels. Although there's an updated version available, I still prefer the older one. Here you can see my render settings. Honestly, there's nothing special about that. One of the great things about Octane is that it works perfectly even with default settings. Just make sure that you use path tracing kernel and not direct lighting kernel when you want realistic results. As for camera settings, I use f-stop for the depth of field with a value of 2.8, and as a focus point I use some simple empty object. After rendering, I adjust the colors and contrast of my images using the inbuilt Blender compositor. Usually it's pretty simple. In this case, I use hue correct node for adjusting the green colors and color correction node to increase the highlight slightly. Although I can achieve the same results in Photoshop, I like to keep things simple, and it's great for me that I can do everything directly in Blender. That's it for today, folks. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video and learned something new from it. If you'd like to support us so we can make more similar content, please consider buying some of our products available on Blender Market. We've got a wide range of ever-growing collections full of realistic assets. By purchasing now, you'll get all future updates for free. Please leave a comment below and let us know what topics you would like to see covered in our next tutorials. Take care and see you next time.